Well, I wanted to talk about something a little more personal today. Some of us homeschool kids who have experienced trauma. And because of that, we as homeschool parents have had to make some really hard choices. And I wanted to talk today about how homeschooling a child with trauma can affect how you homeschool and the kinds of decisions that you may need to make. Now, in the case of both of my girls, their experience that caused trauma happened when they were fairly young. One was 4 and one was 6. And the base event that happened was that I went back to work outside the home, and my husband was the one that was home and homeschooling them. And that might not seem like it would have been that stressful for them. But for a variety of reasons, it was. And no, nothing happened with my husband. I know that's the first thing a lot of people are going to jump to, and that had absolutely nothing to do with it. It was not anything like that. But because of the certain dynamic that we had going on in our home, and because of issues that both of my daughters had genetically that we were not yet aware of because they were so young, it was extremely stressful for them when I started working. And the job I was working was that I was actually teaching. I was a middle school teacher. And so that meant I was out of the house very, very early in the morning. And there would be some days that I wouldn't get home until dinner. And then once I was home, I wasn't just free to do whatever I wanted to. I had a ton of grading. And so for 2 years, we had a very difficult dynamic in our home. That experience caused lifelong trauma that we have been dealing with ever since. Might not seem like a big deal on the outside, but because of certain factors going on with my kids, it was. And so, what that meant is that our relationship, my relationship with both of my girls, was very, very drastically affected. And once I came out of that job and I was no longer teaching and I was back to being their main homeschooling parent, that relationship and the dynamics of that relationship significantly affected how I was able to homeschool them. So, the first thing that I want to just mention to you as a parent, if you have a child who has experienced trauma, first thing is don't minimize it just because to you it doesn't seem like it should be that big of a deal. It could have been a 5-second encounter, but sometimes that is all it takes based on what the encounter was and what's going on with our child mentally, physically, emotionally. Those things can greatly affect how big of an effect that event has. So when you are talking about this situation, this event, whatever it was, don't minimize it. Don't try to convince them that it wasn't that big a deal because what happened back then. They can't go back and change their response. And they can't simply tell themselves, oh, it wasn't actually a big deal. So I don't need to stress about this. That's not how the brain works. And that's not how trauma responses work. And so we need to recognize that that thing that they experienced was a very, very big deal to them. And so when we talk about it, when we confront it, whenever it comes up, when they're dealing with it in therapy, we need to be supportive of the fact that to them at that age, however old they were when that happened, it was a really big deal. And then the next thing that you need to look at is how was my relationship with my child affected by this? Now, if the event had absolutely nothing to do with you, then it might not really affect your relationship with them. But if, like me, you were the one that inadvertently caused that trauma in one way or another. I caused that trauma. I did not expect to cause that trauma. I did not think that going back to work would be such a tremendously big deal for my girls, but it was. And so when I look back, I recognize, okay, the way that they perceive me, the way that they perceive our relationship, and the way that this trauma has affected our relationship is very real and needs to be taken into consideration when I am trying to homeschool them and when I'm just trying to parent them. Because remember that homeschooling is really just an extension of parenting. And so if your parenting relationship with your child is already affected or strained because of particular factors, then of course that is going to filter into your homeschooling as well. Now, one of the things that I had to come to terms with that took me a long time to come to terms with was the fact that because of this relationship strain that I had with my girls, I was not going to be able to give them the kind of homeschooling experience I had wanted to give. And that was because part of this trauma response was that my daughters did not want to work with me. They didn't want me to be their main teacher. They did not want to discuss, books and academic
Mhm.
stuff with me. And that was really hard for me to swallow because, of course, like every homeschooling parent, I went into our homeschooling journey with this big, beautiful dream of what it was going to look like for our homeschooling family. And I had to realize that my kids didn't want to be a part of that. They didn't want to engage in those things with me. And I had to take a really big step back and I had to divorce myself emotionally from their education and from their choices and from their trauma response. I had to realize, look, I didn't do this on purpose, but this happened. This was the response. I understand why they are reacting the way that they are. And I can't change that. I can't just come in with a magic wand and poof, make all of this go away. It's going to take time for them to work through. They need to be willing to do the work in therapy to get over certain aspects of that trauma. And I can't force that. And I can't require that my kids do that. And so I need to step back and say, okay, this is our reality now. The reality is that they don't want to homeschool the way I had always dreamed of homeschooling. And they don't want to have the relationship with me in terms of, activities and things that we do together that I expected us to have. So, yes, this would have been a beautiful homeschooling experience, but I have to set that aside and I have to look at each of my children individually and say, how do they want to be educated? How are they choosing to be educated in this season? And it may just be a season. There may be a time when your child has been able to process and let go of that trauma and gets to a point where they're like, yeah, let's do this thing that you wanted to do, mom. Absolutely. This sounds fun. Let's homeschool the way that you wanted to homeschool. But it's also possible that they're not going to get to that point. Or it may be that they do get to a point where they have released that trauma, they're willing to work with you, but they still don't want to homeschool the way that you dreamed about homeschooling. And this is something that every homeschool parent has the potential of having to face the fact that they have their own ideas for how they want to homeschool, and that might not align with how their child is wired. If you are really in love with the Charlotte Mason idea of living books for everything, but you have a child who's highly kinesthetic and dyslexic and hates reading, it's going to be really, really hard to teach them in a way that is so book heavy. So there are times when any homeschooling parent may face that issue of having to say, okay, this is how I want to homeschool, but this is how my child is wired. And then you have a choice that you need to make as a parent. And I think those of us with trauma, we face this choice for different reasons, but we all face this choice when we get to a point where we realize that our children and the way that they are wired or whatever their experience was is in conflict with what we wanted to do and kind of the vision that we had. And that choice is to say, okay, I can either lay down the law and say, I am the parent, I am the authority. I think we need to do things this way, and therefore that's the way we're going to do them. Or we can say, I had a dream. I'm going to set it aside because this is your education and not mine. And I value peace in our home. I value you as an individual. I am willing to respect your wiring, the way that you are wired, whether that's just who you were from birth or that's how you are now because of the trauma. And whether it's, permanent wiring or temporary, doesn't really matter. It's what reality is right now. And so I'm going to choose to acknowledge that that is just who you are. And that in order for you to learn, you need to be taught in a way that is going to align with what you're looking for in your education. Even if that means I need to put aside what I really wanted to do. And there are some kids for whom you can do the whole lay down the law thing and your relationship survives. Your kids just have maybe a more easygoing personality or they're a little more laid back. They're willing to roll with that. You may, on the other hand, however, have very strong personality children with very strong opinions, children with leadership traits, and they push back against authority for a variety of reasons. Or maybe it's just you that they push back against because of the trauma, the way that my girls pushed back against me because of trauma and the role that I had inadvertently played in that. We have to recognize that relationship, and this might sound, there's going to be some people that have trouble with this, but I stand by it. Relationship and keeping your relationship with your child intact is more important than pushing a particular educational ideology. You may absolutely hate conventional school, that whole system, the textbooks and tests and workbooks, and you do not want to do that, but that's what your child wants. Whose education is it? Who's going to actually have to use these materials and learn this way, you or your child? Are you more concerned with being the authority, or are you more concerned with building a solid relationship with your children so that they love you and they trust you? Okay, of course I want my kids to love me, but what's more important is that they trust me and that they know that I respect them so that they can say what's on their mind and be honest with me. I want us to have the kind of relationship where when they screw up, they're not afraid to come to me. I want the kind of relationship where my kids know that I value them above these plans that I had that I really, really liked. And I really, really liked those plans. But I did not care about those plans as much as I care about my child. And I want them to know that they are the most important thing to me, not this dream for a beautiful homeschool experience. And they do need to realize that when they go out into the world and they hear about other people's educational experience, whether it be in public school or private school or homeschool, and they realize, gosh, my experience was not like that. I really wish we had done this and this and this. And, I'm kind of bummed that my mom never did those things with me. They need to realize I had to choose whether I was going to push and make you learn all that kind of stuff. Because trust me, I wanted to teach you those things. I wanted us to have that kind of education. Or did I value peace? Did I value our relationship? Did I value your autonomy as a fellow human being with opinions, who is the one who actually has to learn this stuff, and therefore should probably have more of a say in how that experience looks than me? So, child, when you see these other experiences that people had and you think, gosh, I wish I could have been taught that way. I wish my mom had homeschooled me that way. You need to realize, she could have, but I, as the homeschooled child, did not want that. So I'm the one who chose not to have that kind of education. But what did I get instead? I got an environment that was supportive, that prioritized my mental health, my emotional health, my physical health over some checklist of academic skills. I got parents who were open with me and who gave me the freedom to exercise my own educational choices. I got a family that was peaceful because we were not constantly butting heads and having all this contention over homeschool trade-offs, right? You can't have everything. You can't always get what you want. But sometimes you get what you need. That child needed a place to heal. They needed a place that was safe. They needed to not be expected to learn things when they were in fight or flight mode, or when they were so incredibly depressed that they couldn't even get out of bed. They needed a place where who they were as a human being was valued over some checklist of subjects and assignments. Personally, for me, my relationship with my children is far more important to me, particularly as a Christian mom who understands that my relationship with my children significantly affects their view of God and their relationship with the Lord. And that if I do this whole lay down the law thing and I create this very rigid environment, that is not going to win them over to the grace and freedom of Jesus. That is the thing that I am most concerned about as a parent. That is my biggest goal, is for my children to know and love Jesus. And I don't want to do anything that is going to hinder that from happening. Does that mean I do not discipline my kids? Absolutely not. There is definitely discipline. It's respectful, though. I don't punish my kids ever. But there are consequences and there's discipline. Discipline is not punishment, folks. That is a very different thing. Punishment makes somebody feel bad for something. Consequence is just, well, when this happens, this happens. That's, cause and effect. Yes, there is discipline in my home. And yes, my kids get told no, but it is all done from a place of discipleship and training and helping them understand what is acceptable in the world and what is not. That kind of relationship where I can do that with my kids is far, far, far more important to me than whether or not my kids know all of these facts and have all of this book knowledge and have memorized all these things, because they can go out and learn that stuff at any time. There's nothing that they can learn now that they can only learn now. Everything else, they'll be able to go out into the world, and when they need to know that fact or they need to learn that skill, they can do it then. But what I cannot do in the future is create a home environment that nurtures them and loves them through this experience that they had and makes it a safe place for them to heal. I can't go back in time and do that. When they go out in the world, they can learn whatever they need to learn. And does this mean that my kids are sitting at home and we're not learning anything? No, it does not mean that. They're learning, trust me. But the learning comes second, sometimes third, in terms of priority to other things. And relationship is always my first priority. Realize that, yes, you can absolutely set boundaries about what you will and won't do. My kids knew. They've been told from the beginning, public school will never be an option. And I had a child who asked me every single year, including PowerPoint presentations on why she should be allowed to go to public school. Every time the answer was the same. No, that is not an option for our family. But I will bend over backwards to give you the homeschool experience that you want as much as I possibly can. And there were some years I was able to do that. There were some years that I wasn't. But I always made the effort and I always involved them in those decisions to show them I value your choices. I value your opinion. I value the fact that this is your education and not mine. So if you are facing that, I just want you to know it's okay to let education not always be the most important thing, because honestly, education is not the most important thing. It is an important thing. It is a very important thing. But in certain seasons of life, it cannot be the most important thing. Mental health, physical health, emotional health, healing, those things sometimes have to take priority, and it's okay. And your kids can catch up. Your kids can learn the things later that they would have learned during that time that was lost while they were healing. Although I would say that time spent healing is never lost time at all. Know that your kids will be okay. Know that just because you made this choice to prioritize healing and relationship and safety over the checklist of work does not mean that their education will have been a disaster. It's just going to look different. That's all. It's just going to look different. And it might come in fits and starts, and there might be chunks that they learn later, even after they have gone out on their own. They might find things that they're like, yeah, I don't remember us talking about this. And you might find yourself saying, we did an entire 3 months on the respiratory system or whatever. I can't believe you don't remember that. But they don't. And quite frankly, there are going to be kids who did not experience trauma, who were taught plenty of things that they're not going to remember in the future, right? But even in your situation, particularly in this situation, there may be some other factors that cause them to not remember what they were taught, they've blocked out certain periods of their life. And you don't get to choose what parts you block out, you block it all. So that means they lost all of the education that came in that point too. So does that mean that they never get to learn that thing again? No, of course not. Just means they learn it later. It means their education looks different. Grace and peace and lots of prayers to you, fellow mamas who are going through this, because I know it is hard, but you can do it. And you and your kids will be okay.